On the night of the 29th of December 1972, 101 people died in the Florida Everglades because of a light bulb. Not a storm, not an engine fire, not a bomb or ice or a failure of the great new machine they were flying in. A light bulb, a small green indicator lamp on the instrument panel worth a couple of dollars that had quietly burned out. The machine was Eastern Airlines Flight 401, and it was one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, a wide-body jumbo jet, 3 engines, brand new, delivered to Eastern only that August. It was the future of flying. It was comfortable and enormous and safe, and on the 29th of December it left New York for Miami carrying 176 people through the winter dark. It never landed. Somewhere over the black, flat, endless wetland of the Everglades west of Miami, the plane came down out of the sky so gently that not one person on the flight deck realized it was happening. It didn't dive. It didn't shudder. It simply, slowly sank, while 3 experienced pilots stood around a burned-out light trying to work out whether the landing gear was down. That is the true documented story of Flight 401, and it is horror enough on its own. 101 people killed by inattention in the dark over a swamp. But it isn't where the story ends. Because after the crash, after the wreckage was pulled out of the Everglades and the dead were buried, Eastern Airlines did something ordinary and thrifty and, as it turned out, deeply strange. They took the undamaged parts out of the wreck, the galleys, the ovens, the good components, and they fitted them into other planes in their fleet. And on those planes, the crew of Flight 401 came back. So let's start with the crash, because the crash is the foundation and the ghost story means nothing without it. Flight 401 left John F. Kennedy Airport in New York that evening, bound for Miami, with 163 passengers and 13 crew. In command was Captain Robert Loft, Bob Loft, 55 years old, a veteran, one of Eastern's most senior and trusted men. Flying the approach beside him was First Officer Albert Stockstill, 39. Behind them at the flight engineers panel sat Second Officer Donald Repo, 51. A fourth man, an off-duty technical officer named Angelo Donadeo, was also on the flight deck. The flight was routine. The night was calm. And as they came down toward Miami, close to 11:30, the crew lowered the landing gear. 3 green lights should have come on, 1 for each set of wheels, confirming the gear was down and locked. 2 came on. The third, the nose gear light, stayed dark. Now this is almost certainly nothing. The likeliest explanation by far is exactly what it turned out to be. The gear was fine and the little bulb behind the green lens had simply failed. But the crew couldn't be sure. And you don't land a jumbo jet on a nose gear you're not sure about. So they broke off the approach, climbed back up to 2,000 feet, put the plane on autopilot, and set about solving the problem. And that's where it went wrong. Because all 3 of them got absorbed in it. Loft, Stockstill, Repo, the whole flight deck bent over a $2 light bulb. They pulled it out, they tried to reseat it, they fiddled with it. Repo went down into the electronics bay beneath the cockpit to look at the gear directly. The minutes ticked by, and every mind on that flight deck was on the light, and no mind was on the one thing that actually mattered, which was the altitude. At some point, the investigators believe it was when Loft turned in his seat to talk to Repo behind him, someone bumped the control column, just slightly. And that small nudge switched the autopilot out of the mode that holds your height and into a mode that let the aircraft drift downward. The plane began to descend, slowly, a few hundred feet a minute, gently enough that no one felt it. And over the Everglades at night, there is nothing to see. No lights, no towns, no horizon, just black swamp below and black sky above, and no line between them. A crew looking out the window would have seen nothing to tell them they were sinking. A crew looking at their instruments would have seen it instantly. They weren't looking at their instruments. A soft chime sounded in the cockpit. An altitude alert, the plane trying to tell them. On the recording, no one reacts to it. They're still talking about the light. In the last moments, Stockstill finally notices something is wrong with the altitude and says so, and there is the beginning of a question. And then, Flight 401 flew into the Everglades at hundreds of miles an hour and broke apart in the dark water and the sawgrass. 101 people were killed. Remarkably, 75 survived. The flat swamp and the way the aircraft broke up absorbed some of the impact, and rescuers came across the water in airboats and pulled the living out of the wreckage through the night. First Officer Stockstill died on impact. Captain Loft died in the wreck before he could be freed. Don Repo survived the crash itself, but died of his injuries the next day. The investigation found what we've just described, a crew that let a burned-out bulb pull all their attention off the aircraft until the aircraft flew itself into the ground. And out of that finding came one of the most important changes in the history of flying, the whole discipline now called crew resource management, which exists in large part so that a cockpit never again fixates on one small problem while the plane quietly kills everyone aboard. In a real sense, the deaths on Flight 401 have been saving lives ever since. That's the part that's documented, investigated, certain. Here is the part that isn't. In the aftermath, Eastern Airlines salvaged what could be salvaged from the wreck. This is normal. A jumbo jet is enormously expensive, and undamaged galleys, ovens and components are worth recovering and reusing. So the good parts of Flight 401 were taken out of the Everglades, refurbished, and installed into other L-1011s in Eastern's fleet, including one aircraft, registration N318EA, that would become the centre of everything that followed. And on those planes over the next year or two, the crews began to have experiences. They were reported quietly at first, the way these things are. Crew to crew, in the galley, in the crew room, and open secret in the fleet. And the striking thing about them, the thing that separates this from an ordinary ghost story, is what the dead men were reported to be doing. They weren't frightening anyone. They were working. One of the most repeated accounts, a flight attendant aboard N318EA looked into the glass door of a galley oven, an oven built from salvaged parts, and saw a man's face looking back out at her. She recognized it. It was Don Repo. She called 2 colleagues over, and by the account they saw it too. And the face spoke. It said, "Watch out for fire on this plane." On the return flight, one of the aircraft's engines gave trouble and had to be shut down. Another, a flight engineer beginning his pre-flight inspection, encountered a second officer he didn't recognize, who told him, "You don't need to worry about the pre-flight, I've already done it." The man was later identified from photographs as Don Repo. Repo, who had died still trying to check the gear beneath the cockpit floor. Another, Repo seen in a cockpit, warning the crew of a faulty electrical circuit, which was then found and replaced, and Captain Loft was seen too. In one account, a senior flight attendant asked a captain to go and check on a man in an Eastern captain's uniform sitting in first class, who seemed dazed and wouldn't answer and wasn't on the passenger list. The captain went, looked at the man and recognized Bob Loft, and as he recognized him in front of the crew, the figure simply vanished. There were more. Loft's face in an overhead compartment, a knocking from beneath a cockpit floor that led a pilot to open a trap door, glimpse Repo, and then discover a mechanical fault that could have caused an accident. An Eastern executive who said he'd chatted with a captain on a flight and only realised afterward who it had been. The reports were persistent enough and came from enough sober professional people, pilots, engineers, flight attendants, people with careers and reputations to lose, that in 1976 a writer named John Fuller set out to investigate them and turned them into a book, The Ghost of Flight 401. Fuller began, by his own admission, as a skeptic. "I was conditioned all my life," he wrote, "to believe there is no such thing as ghosts." He interviewed dozens of airline staff, and he came away believing. And then quietly, the story ended. Around 1974, Eastern Airlines removed the salvaged Flight 401 parts from its fleet. The airline never gave a supernatural reason, never gave any public reason at all. It flatly denied there had ever been anything to it, no official reports, it said, no memos, no maintenance records tying any part to any sighting. But the parts came out, and after they were gone, the sightings stopped. So what do we do with the ghosts of Flight 401? There are 3 honest ways to hold it, and the theory section here is short because the heart of this story was never a debate. The first is that it was real, that Bob Loft and Don Repo especially, who died the day after the crash, still on the job, still trying to fix the plane, didn't fully leave. That they stayed with the aircraft or with the salvaged pieces of the one that killed them and went on doing the only thing they knew how to do, which was to watch over the plane and everyone in it. The strength of this reading is the sheer number of reports, the credibility of the people making them, and the eerie detail that the warnings sometimes came true. Its weakness is the one every ghost story has. None of it can be proven, and the best accounts reach us second-hand through a book. The second is that it was grief and suggestion. This was the first crash of a jumbo jet, an enormous shock across a close airline family. Crews were mourning, shaken, and flying the very same type of aircraft, some of them literally carrying pieces of the dead plane. In that atmosphere, a reflection in a dark oven door, a tired stranger in a uniform, a knock in an old airframe becomes Loft, becomes Repo. And a good story, once told, spreads and sharpens with every retelling. The weakness is that it has to explain away a lot of specific independent accounts as coincidence and imagination. And the third is probably the truest, and it's the one this channel usually lands on. That something real happened, a genuine haze of strange unsettling experiences among grieving Eastern crew after a terrible crash. And then the telling did the rest, weaving real unease together with hearsay and embellishment, and the deeply human, deeply comforting idea of dead airmen still protecting their passengers, until you can no longer pull the experience and the legend apart. A true disaster, a real fog of strange reports, and a story that grew bigger and cleaner and kinder than anything that can now be checked. The L-1011s are long retired now. Eastern Airlines itself is gone, out of business since 1991. The salvaged parts were pulled decades ago. The Everglades have long since closed back over the place where Flight 401 came down. What lasts is the story. And what makes it last, in the end, isn't fear. Most ghost stories are about the dead wanting something from us. Revenge, release, attention. This one is the opposite. The ghosts of Flight 401, in every account, wanted only to keep people safe, to finish the pre-flight, to warn of the fire, to point at the fault before it killed anyone else. Two dead airmen who, whatever you believe actually happened, never seemed to stop doing their jobs. Was it really them, Loft and Repo, unwilling to leave the aircraft? Was it a grieving airline seeing its dead in every oven door and empty seat? Or was it a true and terrible night in the Everglades, slowly turning, in the retelling, into something almost gentle? A story a frightened industry told itself that the men who died watching over a broken plane might still be watching over the ones that flew after. 101 people died over a burned-out light. The men at the controls died still trying to fix it. And for a few years, on a handful of planes built from the pieces of the one that fell, the crew kept saying the same quiet thing. That Don Repo had already checked the aircraft. That everything was going to be alright. That you didn't need to worry. That he'd taken care of it.